from that team, I'd like to invite Mollie to take the floor.
Up until this time into the debate, there's been this issue of legitimate versus illegitimate rebel groups. We all agree that the illegitimate rebel groups that kill women and children and rape and force slave labor, we don't really want to give them money. There was an assumption that'll perhaps make them a bit more legitimate, but they haven't really explained why. And we all agree that the legitimate groups, well, we'd like them to get the resources to get the human rights they want. And I'm going to refute that in my refutation. And I'm going to say, the illegitimate groups, if we do give them money, and if we assume one aspect of illegitimacy is not respecting human rights, this will lead to more death than the benefits of the legitimate group. Why? For two reasons. One, because the illegitimate groups don't care as much about the amount of lives that end up being killed in their revolution. The legitimate groups do care about the amount of lives, so even if they have less resources, they're not going to take steps to necessarily kill more lives. And they have the popular force to be able to get voluntary aid and charity. So we believe at the end of the day, even though most people will be harmed, both illegitimate and legitimate, the harms of the illegitimate far outweigh than the benefits of the legitimate. I'm going to explain to you two things. First, I'm going to explain to you why trading with these rebel groups is bad for the multinationals in the long run and therefore is against the responsibility towards their shareholders and themselves. And then I'm going to talk about the responsibility of multinationals to the world, to their employers, and to their customers. I'm going to quickly start with a little bit of refutation. We heard this assumption that if people have prosperity, then there's really no reason to rebel in the long run. And we have two answers to that. First, rebels often don't want to spread their wealth, because they as individuals want to keep their place in power within the rebel group. That's one issue. But what about the people that aren't rebels? It's often a choice between their rebel leaders that are power hungry and the state, which is power hungry. So it's not like they're going to somehow benefit more if the rebel groups get wealthy, as I said, because they often don't care about spreading this particular wealth. No, thank you. And we also heard this idea, well, they're more likely to reach a resolution if they're wealthy, so at least things will be toned down a bit, there'll be a little bit less war. But why? If they have wealth in their hands, if they have weapons in their hands, they're finally in a place of power, they have less of an interest in actually coming to a negotiation, because now they can get this sort of quasi-independence. We also heard this idea that, well, it's just trade. But that's the point. For rebels, it's not just trade. It's just selling items that they use in order to rebel against their own governments, often for illegitimate means. When it's legitimate means, they get some sort of aid and voluntary charity and voluntary popular support. And when they don't get this voluntary support, they use it against their own populace. So in the instance where they don't get this voluntary monetary assistance, it is often used against their own populace. No, thank you. And we also have this idea of sort of trickle-down economics. And I pointed out, well, this is certainly limited to an extent. And they said, oh, no, it's not very limited because we have to empower all these miners who are giving us diamonds. And to empower miners, you have to really give them a lot of power. And I was like, if you put a gun to someone's head, they will become really, really good miners. But it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be really, really empowered. And also, wealth doesn't necessarily, no thank you, lead to democracy. There isn't really a correlation on a global scale with gaining wealth and leading to democracy. You often have a correlation and an overlap, but one doesn't necessarily lead to the other, if only because once a political leader has a lot of wealth, he doesn't want to necessarily empower the people, he just wants to keep his wealth. And we also heard this idea of sort of like small steps and sort of encouraging people to become more democratic and being a little bit less violent. But that's the point. Multinationals are not political actors. We don't want multinationals deciding who we want to legitimize and who we want to assist and not assist. So that's why we're putting a blanket assumption that all multinationals should not intervene, because they will often intervene for the benefit of the illegitimate rebel groups. And we also heard this idea, well, it's harder to sort of, well, I don't really have enough time to sort of step down and get less money than gaining money, because, you know, losing money is more painful than gaining money. Well, under that logic, no thank you. These rebel groups will be less likely to want to benefit in gaining money by trading with you if the trading is conditional upon what you think will be future giving up certain power. So they won't necessarily step into that area in the first place if they think there's going to be future conditions that they don't agree with, because benefiting in the future is apparently not as beneficial as losing. No, thank you. Going on to my constructive points why it's bad for multinationals. Now, rebel groups are unique. There are a lot of areas in the world where employees don't have a lot of power in their human rights abuses, but rebels are unique in that it often leads to turf warfare. And turf warfare is very bad because it spreads to other goods. And what does this mean? And why does specifically do rebel turf warfare spread to other groups? A, because their main aim is not to build a good infrastructure for the future. They tend to have less at stake, so they just have an interest in making sure it doesn't spread. No, thank you. And by definition, they tend to get their power from guns, not building really nice schools and roads. So they have less of an interest in creating an infrastructure in the future. They also, most importantly, and lead to turf warfare. What does this lead to? A number of things. A, it makes it harder, no thank you, to get resources later. For example, emeralds in Colombia became very difficult to get when there was a lot of rebel fighting over coke because the turf warfare simply spread. So if you have one resource that ends up having a little bit of a scuffle over it spreads and affects other resources in the future, make it more difficult to invest, these multinationals to invest in the future. B, it makes the economy, no thank you, not as diverse because there's less inner competition because the rebels tend to control a lot of these particular resources because they need to control the resources in order to make the rebel group successful, so that there's less diversification. This leads to slower development, even less infrastructure, and less local populace, no thank you, that have the skills to be able to make sure that your investment is maximized. An example of this is cocaine in Colombia, not the emeralds, the cocaine itself. The areas they're significantly, just a moment, less developed, and as a result, the investment in other goods became more difficult. This hurt the multinationals maximizing a profit. Yes, please.
Okay, this is exactly correct. If they don't have any option of trading normal things, they trade drugs and people. That's exactly why you have to trade them something that they can trade without hurting anyone.
You're just assuming that when these drugs are traded, this leads to bad things, but good things trading, like emeralds, doesn't lead to bad things. I'm saying both these things lead to really, really bad things. Coke maybe is worse because a lot of people get addicted in the United States, whatever. But we're saying both these things lead to turf warfare, and both of these kinds of turf warfare expand the area of conflict and therefore lead to more difficult investment in a wider area. Going on to my second point, which is responsibility of multinationals. A, they have a responsibility to the world. Why do they have a responsibility to the world? A company is reliant on a certain level of a reciprocal relationship. When you buy a good, you get a good back. And you're assuming that the person you bought the good from also had that good because they bought it from someone else in a reciprocal relationship. With rebel groups, and the reason when you go to a store you know that the good wasn't stolen because you know you're living in a state that makes sure that those stolen goods aren't stolen. With rebel groups you don't exactly know what the source is from, so you don't know if that particular good you're buying is stolen or not stolen. For example, being the diamond industry in Sierra Leone, you don't actually know if the diamond was stolen or not because they don't have these centralized state enforcement to make sure that thievery is not occurring. So you don't know exactly if it is or it isn't. And this is bad on two levels. It's bad because you're not fulfilling your responsibility as a multinational to make sure you're dealing with reciprocal relationships, and B, you're also not being fair to your customers who don't know where the goods particularly came from, whether they're stolen or not stolen. And finally, you have responsibility to your employers. There's an incredible amount of risk of being an employer in a multinational company that is in a rebel area. There's often kidnapping, there's often assassinations. You don't know if your life is going to be in place, and we think you have particular responsibilities to your employers. So what have I told you today? We told you it's bad for multinationals because it leads to a spreading of turf warfare, a spreading of an area of an economy that you simply can't invest in the future. We believe also that it is not the responsibility of the multinational towards the world, their employers, and towards the customers.
I'd like to thank Mollie for her speech, and